All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us here today for the iBCI-CC Ask Me Anything with Joe session. My name is Jessica Kellerman, and I am the program manager of the iBCI-CC, which is convened by Mass General Brigham. And I am one of the 4 iBCI-CC organizers. The other organizers joining me here today are Dr. Joe Lennerz, who is the Joe that will be answering your questions, and Jen French. And our 4th organizer, Dr. Lee Hochberg, unfortunately will not be joining us today. But if you'd like to catch him, you can come to our inaugural annual meeting, which will be on September 18th in Silver Spring, Maryland. And I think that this event here today will be a great precursor for the annual meeting. So as the title of this event suggests, our goal here today is to demystify regulatory science, the pre-competitive space, and collaborative communities. And I would just like to briefly go over how the flow of today will work. So I'll start off by providing some context on this event and background on Joe. Then Joe will provide an overview on regulatory science and the pre-competitive space. After that, Joe will address some of the wonderful questions you all submitted in advance. And then everything up until that point will be recorded and shared. And then at that point, we will stop recording and transition to a live Q&A session. So presumably you are all here today because you are a member of a collaborative community, specifically the Implantable Brain-Computer Interface Collaborative Community. However, I'd venture to guess that the concept of collaborative communities is new to a lot of us here. The iBCI-CC launched just a few months ago, back in March, and it is the very first collaborative community in the field of clinical neuroscience. And collaborative communities are actually a relatively recent concept, having been introduced by the FDA in 2018. So a lot of us here are learning together how we as a collaborative community can make advancements in the iBCI field. So our session here today is really geared toward helping us continue to discover how we can be better at doing that. Specifically, there are 2 key concepts of collaborative communities that are both important and complex to understand, and we'll be focusing a bit on these concepts today. The first is that collaborative communities operate within the pre-competitive space, and the second is that they create a forum for the development of regulatory science. Now, these terms may feel a bit daunting to those who aren't fully familiar with them, and there are a lot of complexities surrounding them. But luckily, we have Joe, who is our resident expert on the pre-competitive space and regulatory science, and he has graciously offered to answer any questions you may have on these topics. And so before I pass the mic over to Joe, I'd like to give him a little bit of an introduction. Joe is a collaborative community pioneer and a distinguished leader in the fields of medical technology innovation and regulatory science. Joe is currently the Chief Scientific Officer at Boston Gene, where he spearheads efforts to translate cutting-edge gene technologies into clinical practice. Before taking on this role, he spent nearly a decade as a pathologist at Massachusetts General Hospital, where he rose to the position of medical director at the Center for Integrated Diagnostics. As a pathologist, Joe recognized the gaps in regulatory science that were slowing the adoption of innovative diagnostic technologies. This drove him to co-found the Pathology Innovation Alliance collaborative community in 2020, where he has led efforts to transform the regulatory landscape to better accommodate emerging technologies. The Pathology Innovation Alliance collaborative community has grown to over 600 members and has become a model for how collaborative communities can operate in a pre-competitive space to accelerate innovation and improve patient outcomes. Joe truly offers a wealth of knowledge on collaborative communities, so please take advantage of this opportunity to ask him lots of good questions. All right, Joe, I'll go ahead and hand it over to you so you can give your overview, and then I can ask you some of the questions that were submitted in advance.
Wonderful. Thank you, Jessica, and thank you, Jen. And pleasure seeing everyone, some of you again, and some of you maybe for the first time. And, you know, it's very daunting when the title is something demystifying and then ask me anything. I think my initial suggestion was maybe we could call it a beer with Joe. You can probably tell I'm German. So at some point, I think when we all meet in person, hopefully near the DC or Silver Spring area in September, we get a chance to do so. What I wanted to use the first 10 minutes, maybe 12 minutes or so, is to give a few pointers to really just give an overview over the three topics that Jessica mentioned and outlined, to then stop the recording and then really open it up for a conversation. And we want to do this because we are, of course, aware. You see a lot of our colleagues and friends from the FDA on the call, that is often misunderstood. And the interaction in the collaborative community is really a free and collaborative engagement where people really can talk their mind. Nonetheless, we go, let's say, off the record in terms of recording to give everyone the option, to also speak freely. But in any case, I wanted to share my screen and I want to throw a couple of slides up as well as a few materials to illustrate some of the points. And I hope that I can address already preemptively some of the questions that you have seen. And I will not go in presentation mode because I want to jump around in the slides quickly and then open up a few websites, and everything that you see here will be provided to you on the website, etc. So as you heard, there's different layers to the discussion about regulatory science. And one of the things that's really sort of a very tough topic is how to navigate regulation. And I wanted to start with that because it's really sort of a point that I speak from personal experience that I discovered secondarily after making many, many mistakes. And I think most of the people that I spoke to have similar experiences, at least when they come from science. Now, I think you may have seen the scale picture that's part of a fairly short paper. And I wanted to show you just quickly that things with or without regulatory science, typically, not in the short, but possibly in the long term, typically have a larger patient benefit due to risk and safety assessments and just an overall more comprehensive assessment. To understand what regulatory science is, and I can give you the definition in a moment, but the key element here is that there is a science, so it's a scientific discipline, and as with any science, there's a word apparatus, a terminology, a nomenclature attached to it that is fairly hard to understand because it's very nuanced and very, very specific. You may have seen this diagram that shows things like, what is a tool or a device doing? And of course, the what is a very, very hard question to answer. And the actual term for that is intended use. And the intended use itself has a definition that is, really putting a context around, for example, a device. The indication of use is typically defining the patient population and why that subset of patients is potentially applicable to this. And I show you the definition on the next slide one more time, but the instructions for use is, of course, how that is used. And there's, of course, many, many different components to it. There are performance measures around that. There are many other components and mitigation strategy of mitigation measures to potentially move certain things or risks into an acceptability range. So these are just, in this case, 5 very common regulatory terms that often lead to confusion. And whenever there's a question, it is good to understand what those, whether there's a term in there that might have a different meaning. So first take-home message, learn regulatory language. And whenever there's a misunderstanding, it is very important to go back and say, hey, was there maybe a term that we misunderstood or misinterpreted? I can give you a very, very common example. That's the term validation. I think we all use the term validation for all kinds of things. You can call it business validation, right? A return of investment. Is this validating our proposal? At the same time, you could use validation in the context of AI. And there it could be the distinction between establishing and verifying performance. And in that setting, validation might mean something entirely different. And, there are many proposals to move away from that term. However, in certain contexts, it still makes sense to use. I just wanted to throw this out there that might actually cause certain confusion. Now, I wanted to give you an example to illustrate why these terms are so important. So when you look at, for example, and I just picked the device or the so-called medical device definition, and it's pages long, I just tried to parse down some of the components. So it is, on the one hand, a technical device. And when someone talks about a brain-computer interface, and you put the emphasis on interface or on the actual device, maybe the connotation is that it's the piece that will be implanted. But the device, from a regulatory perspective, entails a lot more than just the physical object or the software attached to it. And I'm just using this as one example, that a medical device, when defined, is the combination of the actual technical device, which could be software plus a system, meaning the physical object, in combination with an intended use for a specific regulatory agency. Now let's first talk intended use. So the intended use is, of course, that the system is applied to certain things, and as just illustrated on this slide, for certain indication, in a certain subset, etc., etc. So that is almost like, in clinical trial terms, eligibility criteria. And here, the regulatory language is using an abstract definition of device and intended use for a specific regulatory agency. I made that specific regulatory agency here in red because, of course, regulation is territorial. And I mean this at the national sense. And there's, of course, large and very important, especially for global players, important rules around how to ensure that your regulatory approach is also applicable to other jurisdictions, meaning other regulatory agencies. So here it would be the device, the intended use, and a country. Now, you may have not expected that we talk about countries today when it goes about regulatory science. The reason for that is, of course, that a regulatory agency, as part of the government, the executive branch, has a certain statutory right to exercise their rights in a certain territory. So while certain other countries, I give you two examples. One was recently that, for example, Switzerland has adopted certain FDA approvals as if they were theirs, but that is their jurisdiction, not as if the FDA suddenly has regulatory oversight over Switzerland. And, I'm just pointing this out because I know in some of the questions that you submitted online, there were some questions about, how might this align? And we can discuss later how, let's say, transatlantic or even international or global regulatory interactions are happening. And there's several projects actually driven by the FDA or with the FDA that do so. So in other words, and when you take, and this is literally taken from a device description, when you take out all the, let's call it proprietary things, you will find that certain components are recurring, including the term intended use in a certain disease or other conditions, et cetera, et cetera. Now, this is, of course, a very narrow element to go like directly into the deep layer of the definitions. But I want to show you a few examples of why this is so interesting and valuable before defining or redefining regulatory science. In this paper here, the link again will be provided. We used a few examples where really, I would call it headline-like AI tools promised something, failed, and then were revised. The first one I want to mention that you may have heard about is IBM Watson. And if you haven't heard about it, there's all the links here provided. And I will switch over real quick to this actual table so that this will work. So the very first iteration, and this is the original IBM Watson handbook. It's, I don't know if you know that, but back in the day here, there was actually software description written out like this. And this entire description of IBM Watson had one key issue, that the regulatory concept of intended use was just poorly described. It's a phenomenal analytics engine that can do what it's supposed to do, but it was not described very well. So the IBM Watson Health definition initially said, it can solve all kinds of things, but since it wasn't very well defined, it failed. But it didn't fail because of analytics or because of overpromise, et cetera, but because of a lack of a concise intended use description. The evidence behind that, why I feel confident in saying this, is you can look at a conceptual modeling conference, but I just want to show you a few examples of what happened that when the IBM team, the same team that built this, moved forward. For example, and in this case here, these are two of the researchers from the Global Healthcare Initiative. They actually mentioned specifically, not only in the abstract, also the work, that regulatory and other roadblocks are important to overcome for successful implementation. I show you two other quick examples. This is a systematic review of the entire organization here, again, from the IBM Watson Health team, that identified as one of the key elements here, for example, regulatory pressures. And to just go over one other thing is that the IBM team here, again, IBM Watson Health, joined the ECLAIR initiative and guidelines, which is a group that is evaluating commercial AI solutions in radiology from a regulatory perspective. So I wanted to illustrate this as one almost like historic timeline where the same group that innovated something later on needed to revise something to make it regulatory compliant. A second example, which is from Google, is the so-called AI-assisted screening process for diabetic retinopathy. This was published in 2020 in the so-called CHI. Paper here is published on, of course, on record. And the problem here is that the disconnect is that there was a miscommunication between several elements. And for example, the room wasn't put dark for assessment. And, interestingly, the same team just a few years later put out recommendations for regulating AI, again, coming directly from Google, as well as there's multiple iterations from that, as well as I provide the link, as well as several official contexts of use with actual very specific instructions for use that interestingly followed some of the principles proposed in the software as a medical device guidance. I show you one example personally where I or my group failed. So it's always great to show how you yourself learn. So in this case here, this is an ROC curve, which is showing certain performance characteristics. And one element is, of course, that the area under the curve, the higher it is, the better an algorithm. But you still have to define where you set a cut point to actually get towards actual performance metrics. And that is a fairly regular, I would not call it error, but that the indication of use to assess performance metrics follows certain statistical guidances. I just throw this out there. There's a couple of other examples. And again, this will be shared with you later, just to illustrate that certain components that might be completely unintentional lead to real consequences that might impact the performance of your product or your solution. And in a way, why collaborative communities like the one that you're in right now are so valuable is that we can provide, or that we can all collaboratively assess these elements before that error happens, collaboratively with the FDA, with their insight and expertise, to then potentially overcome these initial errors by preventing it and by doing correct assessments. So in other words, as Jessica has just mentioned, the idea of creating collaborative communities is to ask for a broader input from many stakeholders into these problems and challenges that we face, especially with innovative or new technologies. And in a way, if you want a little bit more of an aggressive definition for this, you could say that the established definition of regulatory science is, of course, the science of developing new tools, standards, and approaches to assess the safety, et cetera, of FDA-regulated products. And traditionally, this area here on the left has been the area of regulators, like some of the pleasant people from the FDA on this call and some of the people that you probably interacted with. A somewhat new, or I should call this revised definition, is that you can also apply the scientific method not only to contribute to this, but even to challenge this. So you could challenge current concept and thereby drive meaningful regulation. For example, online learning or evolving algorithms have already contributed to what's called PCCP. We can talk about that later. But what I'm trying to say is that this is an active engagement with the community to apply the scientific method to provide data to drive more meaningful regulation. If you're not convinced with these examples and with this approach, and with, let's say, that the FDA is truly engaging, you see some of the members on the call, so this is not just a theoretical, and you will potentially talk to people about collaborative community and what is this whole regulatory science piece. And I thought about this for quite a while, how to be convincing around this. And, of course, one of the key questions is, can science itself change things, and can science be trusted without, and I put here government regulation to make it really controversial. So, of course, the three questions underlying this here are illustrating this. And I want to start with the one on the right. COVID was one of the things that happened recently. I don't know if you heard about it. It was this pandemic, and the question is, of course, if you say, well, science delivered the sequence, but the sequence alone could not have protected the public health from anything because you needed other measures, not just the science. And if you go one level higher and say, well, what about discovery bias? Might we be biased? And of course, in science, peer review gives some of our competitors the option of really critically reviewing whether we are, let's say, collectively in a research group undergoing a certain discovery bias, and then the peer review might actually mitigate this. In other words, the government regulation provides guardrails to ensure, among many other things, safety and potential countermeasures regarding this. So in other words, what I tried to show with these 4 or 5 slides quickly is that when navigating regulation, you need a certain language, you need to understand the context there. You might actually be preventing yourself from falling into some of the traps that others have done. And if you take it at the higher level, collaborative communities give an opportunity to provide true input, hopefully scientifically sound data input into regulation. And in my experience, when sharing papers, publications, white papers, data with the agency, that's always very well received. Quick jump, the pre-competitive space. Everything that we just discussed was applicable to competitive as well as pre-competitive space, where you can totally interact with the agency in the competitive space, but this collaborative community is an activity in the so-called pre-competitive space. And that is a very strange space because it's very abstract. You can envision it like an abstract Zoom room or an office or a conference room where people get together, they lock the door, and they solve really tough problems, often not in one session, often over many, many different sessions. And that creates a certain dissonance because people come together and they might not be initially hunky-dory aligned, because they come with completely different vantage points, with different proprietary solutions, and they still need to align. So one element that's sort of unique is in most businesses, in most laboratories, in most academic settings, and most patients have very unique perspective, and all want to be treated as black swans, or there's like something special. And of course, when you're engaging with the agency on your specific product submission, it is a very unique and tailored approach that's confidential and falls under, full-on regulatory stringency and rules and regulations, of course. Here, in the pre-competitive space, many of us get together. We have to learn how to take our singular problems and maybe pause them for a while and see whether other elements might actually be helping as well. And, two of the things that make sense here is that there's a collaborative effort, and it can be research, but it can also be other activities by typically multiple stakeholders before the competition begins. Of course, we're in a field that's beyond emerging, that's existing, and competition is happening. So we're in a very specific setting where pre-competitive and competitive activities happening at the exact same time. That means when you share knowledge or resources and standards, you have basically two hats on. On the one hand, it is this helpful for the field to move the field forward? While at the same time, you might want to consider, well, do we really want to share this? This requires very concise communication and being very clear about whether that is something that you, your entity, your group, your scientific group, or you really want to share with the collaborative community, because once that's there, it is commonly in the public domain. We put many of the things into the public domain, so thereby it might actually truly move the field forward, but that there's of course some concern around that. And I want to illustrate that that is a common approach in many industries, and many things have been accomplished through this. You might know about the story of interoperability with a USB stick. You know, beforehand, there were hundreds of adapters. And the question is, how was this interoperability achieved? And to just quickly say that collaborative community typically have one of these four words here. You could also call that a harmonized approach. And the idea to the solution requires all these structures, and we get to that in a minute, but organizing this in a succinct way with members and project teams, you know, and people like Jessica and Jennifer who help organize this is absolutely key. To give you an idea, for example, the USB group that continues to innovate, I'm sure you've seen a USB-C right now, USB-D and E are already on the horizon. They have basically the same things that a collaborative community has. It's a pre-competitive space. There's membership agreements, there's antitrust guidelines, there's a code of conduct, there's a confidentiality policy, all of these elements to set the rules. And the rules are important because of the, you know, controversial element of a concurrent competitive and pre-competitive space. What's again redlined here is that unfortunately that is underutilized in medicine. And I don't know exactly why, and I won't comment on that, but I have some ideas, but I just wanted to throw it out there as sort of a quick introduction to this topic. To show you a few more concrete things on what is probably relevant and how can things happen in this space. One program, which is a framework, I think published in 2018, which is the Real World Evidence Program by the FDA, which is in large oversimplification a program so you can use actual data created in the real world for submissions or for interactions with the FDA. Now, quickly, real world data is the raw data points. And then after all this data processing with a specific outcome in mind, you might actually get what's called real world evidence. Just the RWD and RWE concept is behind that. Now, one very concrete element is, of course, with any of the, let's say, discussions that we have, how can we get to this data? And the question, of course, is that any and all of the data elements are probably really important. This might actually be, for example, data created and collected pre-iBCI implementation. And how to do this, what structures to use would definitely be, I believe, of great interest to the entire community without interfering with anyone's specific interests. A second element I wanted to give is data accuracy laboratories. There was a publication recently. Again, some of the people here are from the Coalition for Health AI. Some of the folks here are from the FDA, for example, Troy Taspas. And I just wanted to point to this paper that is a very important element. One other concept that we discussed previously is this so-called predetermined change control plan. And this is a largely oversimplified visualization. We can talk about this a little bit later, but if you're, you know, a lot of the preconception is the agency cannot regulate evolving algorithms, but it is definitely included in this guidance with modification protocols and an impact assessment, and there is an option to achieve an authorized plan. I believe this is still in draft stage, but definitely a regulatory approach. Then finally, two more things. Of course, you already encountered some of the work groups that were created in iBCI-CC, and organizing the work versus organizing the people must be clear, especially, when jumping back real quick, under, antitrust, code of conduct, and confidentiality policy. So what's really important here is to consider who manages, who is the stakeholder here, what is their strategy, and organizing the work itself requires, of course, also development methodology. It could be, some of you, I'm sure, follow agile principles, others more pair programming, where two people sit together, draft something, and have it reviewed by others. So these organizations of project management are, of course, important. Finally, and then I hand it back over to Jessica, is that I wanted to share sort of a view of seven common regulatory considerations when you think about a project or something that you want to tackle. Of course, clinical outcomes and regulatory compliance immediately come to mind, but safety and efficacy and performance assessment, durability or longevity, the user experience, as well as data security, privacy are some of those common things. Now, of course, I apologize to the people from the agency. There's, of course, a lot more considerations, but I just wanted to share this as a quick pointer to not forget anything. So, 5 quick points from my side as an introduction to our discussion. And with that, I will hand it over back to Jessica, and hopefully we can have a great discussion and a lot of questions. Thank you.
All right, great. Thank you. Super helpful. Great timing because there's a loud ice cream truck driving by my window. Hopefully it's behind the mic and you guys can't hear it, but I'll try not to be distracted by that. So we have a lot of really great questions that you all submitted, and I do want to make sure that we leave time for you to ask live questions. So we may not get through all of the questions that everyone submitted. But let's see. The first question that we have is, how is U.S. regulatory science evolving to keep pace with the rapid advancements in BCI technology?
Very tough question. I would say there's 2 or 3 options to answer this. First of all, one of the evolving concepts is collaborative communities, and you're participating, so you're seeing one to really engage with the communities. There are many other programs to do so, and it is important to engage. In my experience, there are more programs than people actually participating in, and that is a missed opportunity. So in other words, what are some of the, let's say, engagements requires a little bit of research and then a very critical decision. So I'm sort of preaching to the choir here. You can either stay within your community and complain about, how the FDA is not keeping up with things, which in my opinion is not true. But those complaintive sessions, typically at scientific meetings or, other components, usually lead to nothing. In reverse, you could not join the complainers and join a group like this, where you really sit down together and get involved, learn another perspective, and then work jointly together. So I would say that's the most practical answer. Of course, there's a lot of other activities within the agency, interagency collaborations, there's divisions with engineering, divisions mostly for review, and there's a lot of intra-agency programs as well to keep up with rapid advancements, but that's just sort of a quick overview. And I mean, maybe, I don't know if David is on the call, wants to say something about that as well, but sorry for just calling you out, David. Sorry.
I'll say hi to that. I think a lot of the times that the specifics are important, that we do hear allusions to rapidly advancing technology, and of course want to understand what specific rapidly advancing technology may pose hurdles. And that is part of the reason for the collaborative community, is that folks can raise those so we're aware of them as soon as possible, because if they're going to have an impact on medical device regulation, we'll have to think through it at some point. So the sooner, the better.
Thank you.
All right, next question. How do collaborative communities effectively influence regulatory decision-making for implantable BCIs?
I would say by making use of so-called regulatory science tools, and that can be quite a few. So this session here is hopefully clarifying some questions that could be considered a resource. I believe some of the work groups have already initiated surveys, white papers, position statements, glossaries. Maybe the community would maybe put out a position paper that says, here are the 10 top elements that we should really work on jointly. And it's exactly these, let's call it in the early stages, summary statements or positions that a community like this with multiple stakeholders can take on that really pushes the field forward. Second element, which I believe is extremely valuable, is in an evolving field with new or forthcoming rules and regulations. As you may know, these guidance documents are, they go through a very specific stepwise process where an initial draft is published and then there's a comment period. And in this comment period, anyone, the public can comment and really help shape this. And the FDA themselves will review the comments and judge and assess whether there's some merit to it. Now, I can guarantee you, if a group like this writes a well-worded and concise statement around some of the things that might go unintentionally in the wrong direction, it will certainly get the appropriate attention. So I believe the power of a community like this, while it may not move as fast as every individual here wants, it has extreme leverage because it is considering, those multiple vantage points. So those are some of the things how a collaborative community can contribute.
All right, great. Those are great tips. Next question. Can you provide some examples of impactful outputs produced by past collaborative communities?
Hopefully, yes. So the real benefit of collaborative communities would be true, tangible things that enable, let's say, more effective or better regulation. Now, at least in the communities that I've been part of, that's ongoing. One pathway is the so-called medical device development tool pathway, where you can provide, for example, data sets or certain tools that help the regulator identify whether a certain device or a certain approach makes sense, yes or no. Now, if that's the case, let's say someone would create, or not someone, a group or a subset of this collaborative community would create a data set, there would be a pathway to push this through to become, let's call it regulatory ready or regulatory grade. Suddenly the data set might be the same data set as before, is very well documented, and many others can benefit from it by, for example, doing certain performance assessments on that data set. Now, some of these collaborative community efforts strive at exactly that. So we try to create a data set that would ultimately be available to the community to do certain, performance assessments. Now, on the way to that, one element that became clear is that, there's a certain training needed. And although that wasn't the intent initially, on that path, it became clear we needed a continuous medical education course. And it's very fascinating, at least in the field of pathology, that became, I believe, the first CME course that's FDA authorized or co-organized, which is another output. So it is, in a way, a combination of using existing regulatory pathways, in this case, data sets or other tools, and to create that. But most of the other things that the collaborative communities have produced are publications, white papers, and the other tools that I mentioned earlier.
All right, great. And I think we'll do maybe one more question and then open it up to live questions. Can you provide examples of past pitfalls you have seen in collaborative communities and how to help us avoid them? such as initiatives that became a big investment of time, but that ultimately didn't result in anything meaningful?
Yes. So I believe the one of the things that's very tough to capture is in regulatory science, small things matter quite a bit. And while the aim is to, let's say, move the entire field forward, I think most of the failures that I can report or that I witnessed are from taking just gigantic aims on, while the goal was something like, yeah, we want to move the field forward, or we want to obtain reimbursement. And, those are gigantic, continents of problems. And certain things might seem too small. They might seem like, oh, well, we can put this together in an hour, but we still need to do them. And then suddenly it becomes such a gigantic problem itself, even though it seemed very, very simple at first. I'll give you some examples. One of the questions about cybersecurity was, what about data breaches? And someone said, well, data breaches have been defined. There's even a data breach repository, and we spend a lot of time sifting through this. Can we define this? Is this mostly hacking, or is this mostly unintentional data breaches, et cetera, et cetera? To just collect that data was ultimately extremely helpful and resourceful, but we didn't move that project forward because the collection of the data was already sufficient, and then people knew, oh, if I need this, I can go to that resource. Another project that was a few people in a community took on was the so-called unique patient identifiers, UPIs, to identify whether a patient is a patient, even when they switch from one hospital system to another. I'm sure you heard about it. Everyone has at least a few medical record numbers in their personal history. And that intent is, of course, totally valid. Like, everyone should have a unique patient identifier, just like a social security number. But the problem is so gigantic. And we just thought, well, maybe we can propose a standard. It's not a standard. It's not an issue of interoperability. It is that it requires so many changes in the healthcare system that we ultimately said, okay, great idea, very important effort, but probably too big for us to tackle. But at least, we put our, let's say, efforts and all the materials that we developed in that on the website. Now let's call it a failure in parentheses, because whenever anyone brings this up, we can say, that is a very, very tough problem. Here's what we've done on that. And that becomes a resource in itself. So I don't know if those are, examples that resonate with this group, but I just wanted to share those as examples, to potentially avoid certain pitfalls. So grab something very small and bring it to the finish line rather than something too big and fail.
I think that's really helpful. Like, one thing I've seen come up a lot in work group discussions is how can we be very pointed in producing outcomes and make sure that those outcomes are actually something that's going to make an impact in the field. So it's really helpful to hear what your experiences are in trying to do that. Okay, so I would like to open it up to live questions now, and I will stop the recording so you don't have to worry about your questions being blasted everywhere.